Ever since the invention of the automobile, the human race has strived to push the limits of both himself and his machine. Competitiveness and sheer determination have driven innovation in racing from the days of steam-powered cars to the heights of modern racing today. If you ask the average person today about the origins of active aerodynamics, many might shrug. Some might say in the early 2010s with McLaren, and even a few might say Porsche with the 1986 959. But none would say the 1950s. Mercedes-Benz created two manual active aero cars in the 1950s that could be considered the earliest precursor to what we consider active aero today. The W194-300SL in 1952 and the W196S 300 SLR in 1955. Both of these cars featured body parts that could be adjusted while driving to aid in braking. While the 300 SL was little more than a roof-mounted adjustable spoiler, the 300 SLR had a section of body behind the driver that raised up when needed and tucked back in at speed. As speeds increased, so did the push for more radical engineering. Chaparral continued the use of an adjustable spoiler in the rear to aid in handling and braking with the 2E in 1966, and the infamous sucker car, the 2J, in 1970. The 2J was unique in that it didn't use any external wings or spoilers. Mounted to the back of the car were two fans powered by a separate two-stroke, two-cylinder engine that pulled air from underneath with side skirts made of Lexan providing seal around the bottom of the car. The vacuum created by this system added an additional 1.25 to 1.5 G of downforce without the additional drag that comes with spoilers. Both of these cars were eventually outlawed by the SCCA due to complaints from other teams. The McLaren team cited the 2J would kill the sport due to its potential dominance, something McLaren had already been doing since 1967. Strangely enough, McLaren's prophecies would come true, but from a different foe, the Porsche 91730. A car so powerful and dominant that it forced the Can-Am Series organizers to impose a fuel restriction on all turbocharged cars, i.e. Porsche. Thus, Porsche pulled out of the 74 season, and the fans left with them. Strangely enough, Formula One was a bit late to the party when it came to downforce, as most of the innovations were of the Colin Chapman variety: simplify, then add lightness. So when F1 decided to join in on the downforce and grip craze at the end of the 60s, it was a bit of a mess for a while. Some attempts were admirable, though ill-conceived. Others were closer to an attempt was made. Then there were some WTF moments, like the Cosworth four-wheel drive testbed. While it was a complete running and driving car, that's as far as it ever got. By the early 70s, F1 had the spoiler thing figured out. Somewhat. But F1 engineers are an odd bunch, so the push for the next big thing kept them putting out some interesting cars. From 74 through 77, six-wheeled cars were that thing. Cars like the March 240 and Tyrrell P34 were introduced. Even Ferrari tried their hand at a six-wheeled car. Only Tyrrell managed to race within a season, winning just once. One more team would have a go at a six-wheeled car a few years later, in 1982, with the Williams FW08B. Test laps proved promising, but before it had a chance, F1 banned any future attempts at more than a four-wheeled car. During that same time frame, other F1 teams were pushing the limits on ground effects that would create a negative zone of pressure underneath the car. In concept, similar to the Chaparral 2J, but the execution was far different. One example is the Lotus 88, designed by Colin Chapman to bypass the rules set forth by the FIA to ban side skirts used on early ground effect cars in 1980 and 81. This car used a unique twin chassis design that allowed the inner chassis to be separately sprung from the outer. The outer chassis was designed as one large ground effects system. After complaints from other teams, the FIA ruled that this design was in violation of movable aerodynamic devices and banned the car from ever competing. Not all racing innovations have been about grip and downforce. Without the push for a lightweight, reliable engine, the Cosworth DFE would have never been designed. The DFE engine was in use in F1 from 1967 till 1983, supplying most of the F1 teams with engines that operated during those years, longer than any other single-designed racing engine. I'm sorry, Ferrari fans, but not all of the 200-plus wins Ferrari has in Grand Prix racing were done with one single-designed 12-cylinder. A far cry from the early days of F1, the 1988 McLaren MP44 was the pinnacle of the turbo era. In the final year of turbo cars being allowed to race in F1, McLaren's tiny 1.5-liter turbocharged Honda V6 produced up to 700 horsepower reliably, although regulations limited turbo cars to 150 liters of fuel for an entire race. The MP44 chassis design and top-notch driving from Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost netted the McLaren team 15 wins, 15 pole positions, and a Constructors' Championship, while Ayrton Senna won the Drivers' Championship. In 1993, Williams used a CVT transmission in their FW15C. Speculation was that the CVT was a good few seconds quicker a lap than the then-standard semi-auto 6-speed. Other innovations on this car, including active suspension, ABS, and 12% better aerodynamics than its predecessor, catapulted Williams to a first in both the Constructors' and Drivers' Championship standings for the 1993 season. Not all recent examples of on-the-edge engineering have been as successful. The Delta Wing was designed to reduce aerodynamic drag dramatically, and with half as much weight, engine power, and fuel consumption, could produce slightly faster speeds and lap times than an Indy car of that era. As the name suggests, it has a Delta Wing shape, with an unusually narrow front track and a more traditional rear track. The car lacks any front or rear wings, using underbody ground effects to create downforce. Active from 2012 to 2016, and over multiple revisions and changes to chassis and engine, the car only managed to finish a couple of times, no higher than 4th. Eventually, legal issues and constant rule changes put the car out to pasture in 2017. So in the end, what was this all for? Why did I just ramble on about innovation? Well, this is my introduction to a If We Could Change the Past series, where I take a deep dive into cars that never were, never meant to be, or ruled out of existence before they could shine. This is What If? On the next episode of What If? The McLaren M6 GT. Could Bruce McLaren pull off a 1970 Le Mans win